and welcome to Cartoon Clearance with Meg and Dan. I am Meg.
And I'm Dan.
And you have just caught us stocking extra Ramblepants in our bomb shelter. Because for this week's episode, we watched The Iron Giant. Daniel, would you like to give us a little background on The Iron Giant?
Gladly. The Iron Giant was released on August 6th of 1999, and it stars crooner heartthrob, I don't know about it anymore, but I know a lot of people like him, Harry Connick Jr., Jennifer Aniston, Christopher McDonald, who plays pretty much a jerk in every movie I've ever seen him in, and the incomparable Vin Diesel. This was his Groot performance before Groot, I consider. The Iron Giant was originally a children's book by Ted Hughes and was released in 1968. Sometime later, guitarist and songwriter Pete Townsend adapted the book into a concept album, and that featured John Lee Hooker, Nina Simone, Roger Daltrey, Pete Townsend himself, and John Entwistle, and others playing various roles that would have been characters in the book. Then a stage play was made in 1993, and the stage director Des McAnuff expressed great enthusiasm that The Iron Giant would make a great film. The idea for the film was passed around from executive to executive. I heard once that Don Bluth might have been involved with it, but he turned it down, and the project ultimately went to Brad Bird. And he was working for Turner Entertainment at the time, and they had just recently merged with Warner Brothers, so now the Warner Brothers animation studio had stepped in with the Turners to put the budget and animation team together. Though Ted Hughes had died before the film was released, his daughter expressed great approval for the final product. Unfortunately, while the film was a huge critical success, garnering lots of awards, the film did not make the box office returns it had expected. Many blamed the lack of marketing on the Warner Brothers' part, as they were apprehensive after their budget for Quest for Camelot had proved fruitless.
Very different caliber of movie there.
The film has gained a significant cult following, and I think is generally a pretty well-liked movie, as far as my recollection goes throughout the years.
Yeah, I see a lot of people who like it as well.
Yes, would you like to give us a little summary of The Iron Giant?
But of course. So, imagine, if you will, that the year is 1957 and the United States are seized by fear of the Red Menace. You have the rambunctious 9-year-old Hogarth Hughes, who lives in the small town of Rockwell, Maine with his single mother, and he causes all sorts of trouble with the crazy woodland wildlife he tries to bring home as pets, friends. But one day he really outdoes himself when he befriends a massive robot that fell from outer space, who would be the Iron Giant of the title. So the giant is basically like a little kid with no memories, no concept of like Earth customs or whatever, like tearing up train tracks is a bad thing. So Hogarth takes it upon himself to teach him right from wrong, good and evil, that kind of thing. However, word gets around to the government about the strange things happening in Rockwell, and before long, Hogarth has to deal with Kent Mansley, a government agent here to investigate. And Mansley suffers from a serious case of having his head up his own butt, and so Hogarth enlists the help of local oddball junk artist Dean McCoppin to protect his giant friend. The situation gets even more complicated when things begin to trigger the giant's memory, and he has to decide what exactly he wants to be. I won't go too in-depth with the details here, in case someone still hasn't seen it. What are your thoughts on this movie, Daniel?
Well, that's someone who hasn't seen the movie. I highly recommend they see it. This is a great movie. I think it really has very few flaws, if any. I picked this movie after having a profound experience watching Erased last week with you, and I thought maybe it's about time I put another movie on the list from, good quality.
Right. As opposed to another Mars Needs Moms.
Yeah. And I thought, Iron Giant, it's kind of a wintry movie. It's pretty good from what I remember, and I had this mini panic in my head, like, oh man, what if it's actually really bad? But it holds up really well, and it's great. There's so much about it that I think is just done so perfect. And I think part of that is my appreciation for the Warner Brothers, their animation department, because I think they get overshadowed greatly by Disney. Some of their movies are not that great, but I think they have a lot of hidden gems. And I'd say the Iron Giant's the best of their outings besides Space Jams probably, but that's another movie for another day. This movie's great. It's got great art, and I made the comment right when I saw it, oh, this looks like Norman Rockwell. Turns out the town's Rockwell, Maine. You know, quite fitting.
Right.
But there's so much expression of emotion in the characters and the way they're designed that it's so just perfectly executed, the way they look or the way they move in a certain scene. I'll get into more of that later. I think you could pause this movie at any moment, and that would be a poster framed portrait worthy hanging on my wall. Like, there's so much great just imagery in this movie, and great themes as well.
Yeah, definitely. It looked great. And I'm that person who saw this movie once a really long time ago. Like, I was too little to even really remember most of it, and I haven't seen it since. So I remembered almost nothing about this movie aside from like a couple of vague images and, you know, the fact that everybody loves it and talks about this being a really sad movie. And I was not disappointed. It was really heartwarming and just really beautiful in a lot of ways, and it definitely had a really good cast that I think did such a good job at carrying the plot of this movie, because I feel like it's not so much about things happening as it is about characters interacting with each other, which is what kind of carries the plot along. Yeah, there were a lot, like you said, there were a lot of really great moments. The introduction scene in particular really stood out to me, where you have this guy on a boat in the middle of the night and it's raining, it's pouring, like the waves are crazy, and he's like he's trying to call in on his radio and be like, I need some help here. And then, you know, he sees a light up in the distance, and he's like, oh no, there's the lighthouse, I see the lighthouse. But then this light just kind of turns slowly towards him, and you see his face change as he realizes that it's like these two massive glowing eyes of this huge creature. That, I thought that was really well executed. It was eerie and it was intimidating, but like there was something kind of ethereal about it as well.
The longshoreman, I'm glad you brought it up, because he was the first character you see in the movie, and you know, you see a couple other people, but he comes back pretty early on, and he's at the diner and he's telling people, I saw this giant and it was huge. You had to be 100 feet tall. And it's so, like, it must be the government or some alien. And everyone's, like, laughing at him and they're making fun of him.
Yeah, it was probably whiskey, knowing you.
Yeah, whiskey, knowing you. And, you know, you have Dean. And this is a good introduction to so many characters, because have Dean sticking up for him. He's like, hey, I saw it too. And then he says, I didn't really see it, but we got to stick up for, you know, the little guy. But it stuck with me. In the background, you know, Dean is in the foreground as the main focus. But you see the longshoreman sort of hanging his head, and the facial expression just sort of droops down to like this sadness that's an array of emotions. Like, he's not sad, he's like disappointed that no one believes him, but also sad. And then I'm like, no, you know what it is? It's loneliness. He feels like no one believes him, and that makes him feel like the only one in the world who knows what's going on.
Right.
And I thought that character is also every character.
Right.
Like, Hogarth is raised by a single mother. All the kids at school he talks about later beat up on him or call him weirdo, spaz. He's alone. He just wants a friend, as you see with him trying to bring a squirrel in a box into the diner. You know, he feels like he can't count on anyone. Dean is a loner. You know, he prefers to live with junk. Essentially not living matter.
Right.
And then you have the mom who is trying to raise a son on her own.
Has to work late nights.
Having to work late. There's still a distance. She feels alone. And like, I like that the longshoreman was like a little bit of an introduction, but he still had more than just this sort of crazy old man character.
Yeah.
To be like, oh, there's something out there. He's not only the trigger, but he sort of has the pebble drop into the ripples of the pond.
Right.
And I think on the discussion of emotions and characters, we can get into why this movie is really successful in establishing great characters.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I guess we can probably start with Hogarth as the main protagonist, I suppose. And, you know, he's 9, he's a little kid, but he's not unlikable for it. And that's something that we've talked about a bunch over the course of, you know, a couple of our recent episodes.
Cough, cough, Milo.
Like, Hogarth he gets into trouble and he causes trouble for, other patrons of his mom's diner and for his mom who works in the diner. But it's not because he's being a little jerk. He's just it's his enthusiasm kind of boiling over and him not being quite able to contain it or control it. He's so excited and because he caught this squirrel, so he runs into the diner and he's got the squirrel in a box, but he's so excited trying to convince his mom to keep it that he doesn't notice it getting out of the box.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
And once again, that's also a nice little scene to show us that Hogarth not only wants to be loved, but is capable of showing love.
Definitely.
Like, he wants to nurture this squirrel. I'm like, can I keep it as a pet?
And the mom's like, you'll just feel bad for it and let it out of its cage.
Yeah. And that's another great little, like, subtle, like, I'd say subtlety.
Yeah.
Is what this film really accomplishes that with all of its characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like, you can tell he's really kind-hearted. And, he's smart and he's lonely. It's nice to see the negativity of, like, being lonely kind of channeled into something positive as, like, I want a pet, I want to take care of something, as opposed to something destructive. And just one little thing of note, I did think it was kind of interesting that he has, like, a BB gun when I doubt he would ever be able to, like, actually shoot anything. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not a gun person. Maybe you just use BB guns to shoot tin cans.
I bet it was just cans. I mean,
Probably.
Maybe he was like, yeah, I'll defend the home or whatever. But that's a story in itself, and that's another interesting thing that the movie does, is that there's lots of objects throughout scenes and homes that you kind of see, and you're like, oh, that's sort of a story in itself. Like, it's never explicitly mentioned, I don't remember at least, but Hogarth, he's only have a mom, so he doesn't have a dad, and you're like, well, what happened to his dad? And, when he goes out to see the Iron Giant, he puts on this aviator helmet and this aviator jacket, and you don't really see it. It's like, well, what would Hogarth be doing with this jacket and helmet?
Right.
And you can sort of fill in the pieces. Oh, maybe his dad was in the army or the Air Force. Oh, maybe he died in action, and you start to, once again, you didn't have a scene of someone being like, Hogarth's never been the same since his dad was shot down over Saigon.
Right. But there's little clues that could lead you to kind of piece out a story.
And so maybe the BB gun, like you said, it's weird that he has a BB gun, but maybe, I'm thinking of it now, maybe that's like his dad gave him a BB gun before he left, or whatever intention. Maybe Hogarth killed an animal and I was like, I can't ever kill an animal again.
Well, actually, the dad going off to war thing could be really interesting in terms of, like, the anti-war themes and stuff in this movie.
Very much
that
so.
would definitely tie in a very fitting way, because you have some really surprising dialogue from this little kid, from this 9-year-old kid who's teaching this giant robot thing how to, I guess, function in this new place. And, the giant doesn't really know anything. He's just kind of doing what he does, which is eat metal. And Hogarth's trying to keep the reins on him so he doesn't do anything too destructive or cause anything to hurt people. He's not a violent creature either. Like, he doesn't go out of his way to hurt things. He just wants to eat. You have this scene where they're in the forest together and they see a deer, and the giant is really curious about this deer, and they have, like, this little moment, and minor spoiler alert, I guess, the deer ends up getting shot by some hunters, and the giant is like, oh, he gets really sad about it, and Hogarth is telling him, like, it's bad to kill, but it's not bad to die.
Oh man, that hit me, like, right in the chest. I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's
so beautiful.
And
a 9-year-old said it.
Right? Like, he's so mature in a lot of ways.
But it's not, I think it's maturity, but there's also a sense of pureness.
Definitely.
To being a child. Like,
yeah.
An older gentleman like Kent Mansley.
Oh, yes.
Who we'll get into in a minute, I'm sure. He probably wouldn't be able to think of anything. Even Dean, who has got great lines, but, it's the pureness of a child that boils down this very complex situation to, it's bad to kill, but it's not bad to die. And, he has this conversation about having, like, souls, and souls go on forever.
Right.
To a robot. And, like, he's never just like, well, you don't have a soul because you're a robot. That never even comes up. And he's just like, it's inside everything. Yeah. And I think it's a great contrast to have this giant robot being able to feel And he's a robot. And robots don't feel. They're made of metal. They're not living.
Right, but this one does.
And they're in the middle of this stunning scenery of like Rockwell, Maine that is thriving with life and is so
Forests
beautiful.
and wildlife and just all this natural beauty. It's a really big contrast. You have the natural versus the unnatural being like the man-made or whatever the giant was made by. And then you also have the contrast between I guess organic and inorganic you would call it. And then you also have the contrast between this creature that is not human and has feelings and has heart versus a human being who has no heart. It's pretty safe to say that. And so you have Kent Mansley, who is the antagonist of the movie, and he's this government agent. He's super condescending and self-important, and he's like the ideal man in terms of how he's drawn and presented. Like he's big and broad-shouldered and tall and
Smokes on a pipe.
smokes a pipe. I guess you would call him conventionally attractive. He's clean shaven. He's well educated.
He's a government man.
Yeah, and he's awful, and he's completely incapable of listening to other perspectives. He's convinced that he's right all the time and is willing to go to any lengths to get his way, and he feels completely justified in doing so, which I think makes him really scary considering there are actually people like him in real life.
I forgot about the scene where he interrogates Hogarth. I forgot that he not only chloroforms him,
Yeah.
but he also says, we can make things really difficult. So difficult that we'll have to take you away from your mom.
Yep.
Like, that's so... Oh, that's just so
Disgusting.
evil and wrong. It's like talking to a 9-year-old kid.
Yeah.
Like,
A
yeah,
9-year-old
he
kid.
knows where the Iron Giant is, but maybe if you were likable, maybe he would have told you.
Right. So that's a really interesting contrast. And one of the big motifs throughout this movie is Superman. Like, you have Hogarth showing his comics to the giant and talking about Superman, who he compares to the giant. Like, he fell from space and he's really powerful, but he chooses to use his powers for good. And you could be like him in terms of using your strength for good as well. And one thing that I thought was interesting, the Superman thing is a theme that kind of recurs throughout the movie, but you have, in another way of kind of contrasting the giant and Kent, there's the similarity in Kent Mansley's name to Superman. So you have Clark Kent, Superman, Super Mansley. Like, I just thought that was really interesting to kind of draw that really stark contrast.
And also a contrast between two male role models.
Definitely.
And I think there's a great scene where Dean, the hep cat,
yeah.
and Clark, the government man, are arguing in between the general because they're saying don't nuke Rockwell. And I think that scene paints a perfect picture of why they're so different. Obviously, one wants the giant to be safe, the other wants it to be obliterated.
Right.
But it's also, throughout the movie, you have Dean, who is a hip, groovy-looking dude, kind of a weirdo on the outsiders, a loner. He makes art out of junk. He's not your conventional idea of a role model.
Right.
And yet Hogarth repeatedly goes to him,
yeah.
even when he lost his squirrel. And, the squirrel went under his table at first, but he's like, don't get mad. But there's a squirrel under the table. And even when the squirrel runs up Dean's pants and starts making him make weird faces,
Yeah.
Dean isn't like, Hogarth, stay the hell away from me. You're a horrible kid. He goes back to the diner, apologizes to the mom,
Yeah.
and it's just like, hey man, Hogarth, he's a good kid. I think he's a good kid. He doesn't really know anything about Hogarth, but he's like, I think he's a good kid.
Well, the thing about Dean is that he is really genuine and he listens and he cares. Like, even if his life has kind of taken him off the beaten path, even if he's not fully on board with something, he doesn't immediately lash out. And he takes people seriously and he doesn't talk down to them. Even Hogarth, who's way younger than him, he doesn't talk down to him. He doesn't hesitate to act when he feels like Hogarth is in danger. But he also doesn't let his personal perception of a situation completely eclipse his ability to consider other possibilities and to consider other viewpoints. And that's another like really big difference between him and Kent.
It's like a movie about parenting styles in a way.
Kind of.
Because Dean lets Hogarth be Hogarth, but still has some limits. And I think a great scene for that is like when he lets him drink espresso.
Right.
In the middle of the night. Like, he's like, hey, Dean, he's like, I got milk, water, some milk. I got coffee. He's like, this is strong stuff. And he's like, I know Hogarth's never had espresso before, but you know what? He's got to learn what espresso's like at some point. He's kind of the cool dad who's just like, now I know you're not supposed to drink before you're 21, but here's a glass of wine. And it's like, oh, cool, Mom. And I mean, I don't condone that personally, but Dean's like, I'm going to let Hogarth be Hogarth. He could be a kid. And then you have Kent Mansley, who doesn't care about Hogarth.
Not at all.
He probably could have accomplished his goal if he was actually comfortable and relaxed. But that's not who he was. He just wanted the ends. He just wanted his answer.
Right.
So he pretty much interrogates Hogarth, ruins his life for a little bit by moving into his house.
Yep.
You know, and then Hogarth subsequently ruins his bowel movements by forcing chocolate laxatives onto Kent's ice cream.
Justly so.
Oh man, that was a great scene. But, you know, he just doesn't care about anyone else. He just wants his answers, and he's all business. And so you have, it's like, well, Kent, he has a job, he dresses well, he has this air of confidence about him, he gets his results, but he's the bad guy. He's not a good role model. You have Dean, who's kind of a weird artist who lives in a scrapyard, you know, listens to jazz music.
Right.
Probably is a reefer addict, to quote Back to the Future. But he's a good guy. You have this great contrast. And then going back to that scene I was talking about with the general, Dean on one side, Kent on the other side, and the general in the middle. And they're both making their case to him. And it's like, this is the image of the polarizing world that either you could say adults or even just men live in, where it's like, you're not a man if you don't stand up for your country. Well, you're not a man if you lie about a kid being dead. That you chloroformed earlier and threatened to take his mom away. Like, great themes. And, you know, you got nuclear holocaust.
Xenophobia.
Even just, my biggest takeaway was loneliness. And I really loved how every character in their own special way was lonely.
Yeah, definitely. And then I really liked how the themes that kind of overcame that loneliness, you had like love in all its forms, kindness, understanding, like patience
Compassion.
and listening, and just like I think we can probably wrap it up about now, but I thought it was really beautiful and well executed, and it looked great and it sounded great. Its themes are still incredibly relevant today.
Yes.
And it made me cry, but it also made me laugh, and I had a really good time watching it, and I definitely recommend it if you haven't gotten around to seeing it yet.
Yeah, I highly recommend it too. I think it's a perfect kids movie, to be honest, because it's got the serious stuff, and I think we've harped on that for a lot. But like you said, the movie is actually really funny, and it's never a whole scene is a setup for a joke or whatever. A lot of it's very like quick or subtle things that just fly by, and they made me laugh out loud, which I don't usually do at movies. I usually just chuckle or smile, but there were some really, really funny scenes in this movie that, you know, they work well. And, you know, it's combined with great music. And one thing I noticed that was great was that Hogarth, like when he walked around, it was like little pizzicato flutes, like dun 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 dun. And then the giant would walk by, it's like boom, boom, boom. And then when they were walking together, it was the two coming together to make a medium sound. And like, there's just so much going on in the movie that works so well because so much thought was put into it. Yeah. Even down to, oh, let's have the music be like this, and oh, let's have the art do this, and so much. Like like I said, the emotion of the characters, their development, the art, just everything. It's a really good movie, and I cannot recommend it enough. And I'd like to end it on one note. I mentioned to my older brother, hey, I'm going to be watching The Iron Giant, and the first thing he said was, I always liked how Hogarth put whipped cream inside a Twinkie. Like, that kid's onto something.
That's the biggest takeaway of this movie.
I said, you know what? I listed all these emotional things and the characters' facial expressions, But you know what? It's Hogarth putting the whipped cream, injecting whipped cream into a Twinkie. That really makes you. This kid's onto something. He's really interesting. But yeah, I think that's gonna wrap it up for this episode.
I think so.
We would appreciate if anyone, out there has some, dissensions or things to add, put it in the comments. We'd love to read them.
Yes,
and
we would.
if you like the video, give a like and tell a friend, share it around. I think that's still a function on YouTube. But we are the Discount Ramblepants. And remember that this channel, this is downtown Coolsville. Population, us.
Oh yeah. We're hip.